Good evening and welcome. I am Richard Griswold, Associate Vice President, Dean of Students, and faculty member at the Boston Architectural College, where our programs in landscape architecture, architecture and interior architecture, and design studies strive to provide excellence in design education emerging from practice and accessible to all. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce the BAC's final lecture in the student-sponsored lecture series of Spring 2025, Just Futures. Our lecturer this evening is Kevin Alter. Kevin is the Sid W. Richardson Centennial Professor of Architecture at the University of Texas in Austin, where he has served as academic director for architecture programs and associate dean for graduate programs since 2001 to 2014. Kevin is a graduate of Bennington College and of Harvard's Graduate School of Design, where I had the good fortune to get to know him in both undergraduate and grad schools. And I can say this to students, it's really wise to stay in touch with people with good ideas. Professor Alter has edited 12 books, curated 16 exhibitions, and organized many symposia. He's been a visiting professor at Columbia, at the Catholic University of America, and he was the Favreau visiting professor at Tulane University. He has also been a visiting critic, reviewer, lecturer at dozens of institutions across the world, around the world. His professional practice, Alterstudio Architecture, LLC, is a full-service architecture and design firm known for its intellect in design, inventiveness, craftsmanship, and details. Kevin's firm has received more than 200 design awards, including 12 national AIA awards. His work has also been widely published, including 2 monographs. One is called Alterstudio, 6 Houses, from the University of Miami Press in Oxford, Ohio. And the other newer one is Highland Park Alterstudio, from the Oscar Riera Ojeda Publishers Masterpiece series. It is a book about one building. For those of you who are on campus, both books are on display with a few other things in the BAC's library. The work of Alterstudio is rooted in deep-seated virtues of architecture, generous space-making, shrewd manipulation of daylighting, and meticulous attention to detail. The heightening of direct human experience and the framing of complex circumstances of their situations are at the core of each project. He believes that great architecture should deepen our everyday experience and at the same time as it elevates our awareness of a larger, changing world. Please join me in extending a warm BAC welcome to Kevin as he presents his lecture entitled Frame.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Rich. I appreciate the introduction and the invitation, and it's lovely to be here. I was telling Rich, I think in 1990, I taught here for a brief stint, and it was really an interesting experience. And I was also telling him that when I was hired at the University of Texas, the man who hired me had looked at the programs and the way I taught here, and he was particularly impressed with the school and the way that I had found a way to get involved with it. And I thought it's been a significant part in my trajectory, and it's really nice to be able to come back and share some of the work I've done in the ensuing few years since then. Hard to believe that was 35 years ago. Anyway, I'm happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to hopefully a spirited conversation after the talk. So I'm really hoping some people have some questions or want to talk about some things or critiques or, whatever, take objection to the work. I wanted to use this talk as a forum to explore and put forth some thoughts I've been having, proposals from which you might understand our work, and indeed proposals that might be seen as a reinterpretation of the modern movement. Accordingly, as a kind of preamble, I'm going to run through these thoughts that have been on my mind for the last few years, and then I have 6 projects that are queued up to share, perhaps to see how these notions kind of work themselves out in my work. And of these, I'm going to spend some more time on the last project, to spend a little bit of time talking about construction detail, how the building might be significant conceptually, but also performatively. I feel a little bit like, if anybody old in the audience might remember, like the lectures that Max Goggin and Merrill Elam used to give in the 80s at the GSD, where they would come with 8 carousels of slides. That would be about 640 images, and run through them in a in an hour. I mean, they were amazing lectures. I'm not quite as fast as Mac and Merrill, and I don't have 640 images, but I probably have too many. So depending on how this all goes, I might race through some of the images at the end. Um, but to how do I advance this? Let's see. The arrows don't seem to be doing anything. Rich? Or okay, what did you push?
Just clicked on the screen.
Oh, okay.
There's a place over
Uh,
here which lights up.
I see. Brilliant. Thank you. So I was just going to put a few things up for you all to look at while I'm sort of talking. To begin, I should explain that I really believe that architecture is best understood in intimate moments, in one's encounters and experiences in and around buildings. And this is the basis for much of the work that I've done, and points to an interest that I have in phenomenon, experience, perception, engaging all the senses, material presence, light, all those elements that combine to determine the atmosphere of a constructed place in the world. And I wanted to begin with this sort of collection of intimate moments from projects in the office over the last years, not so much to explain any particular project, but rather as a kind of touchstone for how I'd like to portray our work in moments, the collection of which adding up to a kind of atmosphere, really what might be called the rose-colored glasses version of Instagram. And I wanted to start with just this sort of preamble of images, just to say I think this is how we understand buildings, like not so much in a kind of larger conceptual apparatus, but through moments like these. And clearly I put in too many, so I wanted to get to one slide here. Where are we? So many slides. Okay. Now here, so more apropos, I suppose, like we might think about the ancient Buddhist parable of the blind man and the elephant. I suspect many of you know that sort of old parable. It's originally started, I think, in 500 BC, but it's often used. It's the story of a group of blind men who have never come across an elephant before, and who conceptualize what the elephant is by touching different, albeit small, portions of the elephant's body. While this story is often cited to critique our tendency to claim larger truths based on a limited subjective experience, ignoring others' subjective experiences, I'm referencing it here for a really different reason. Like anything too large or complex to be easily comprehended, understanding the sum total of an elephant, or a building for that matter, requires the stitching together of a collection of intimate experiences of that creature or that building. Such an understanding privileges the rich, sometimes seemingly contradictory characteristics of a creature over and above its more simplistic, diagrammatic understanding. And I hope that you can keep this image of a rich architecture in your mind's eye as I continue with our proposals and share our work. Now, uh, in this kind of preamble, I want to just touch on a few thoughts. I want to briefly talk about the modern project. And I think I think of my office as one of continuing the modern project, as we're modern architects and the work we do is modern. Admittedly, it is our generation, or probably more likely your generation, that we'll have to find ways to build the new versions of the Farnsworth House without its blinders to concerns of sustainability, for example. But I love this stuff. I love the ambition. I love its powerful spatial condition. I love its authority as an artifact, its bold vision for reimagining the environment that defines living and shelter. I love its forthright enthusiasm for innovative building methods, its expressive reticence, and of course, I love its direct engagement with all the elements that define its circumstance. And here, like Rafael Moneo, I'm specifically not using the term context. I mean, like all of the things that define its circumstance. However, in the way in which modernism has been often defined and disseminated, I think that way is often at odds with at least my interest in this work. Um, Here I am referencing the importance and general agreement placed on, sorry, I suppose I should have the mic somewhere here for the folks online. Here, I'm talking about the importance And I think generally people agree on the on like issues of clarity and simplicity. Equating these characteristics with a positive value judgment, I think you know what I mean, that somehow simple lines and clear form is a good thing simply because it is simple and clear. And following that line of reasoning, the great value that's placed on the clear diagram. For me, I fear that when the clear diagram or the ambition of simplicity is followed too literally, it becomes a kind of siren's call, and we're lulled into a false sense of beauty, and all too often end up on the rocks of not knowing how we got there. To be clear, I'm not arguing for making an architecture that is complicated. Far from that. Rather, ours is a call for embracing complexity, the kind of complexity that's ever present in the atmospheres and the circumstances and material realities of experiencing the physical environment. So, as a means of illustration, if one were to ask a layperson, what is modern architecture? One would probably receive answers not so dissimilar from parts of Le Corbusier's Villa Savoye. A certain ruthlessness, clean lines, platonic shapes, a ribbon window that shows that the wall isn't holding up the building, but there's something else holding it up. It's white, it's clean, it's simple. But if you ask that same layperson what is modern art, I think you'd get a really different response, aside from the kind of disparaging jokes like children could do something like that. Um, you might hear them refer to a Picasso or a Braque portrait, or perhaps Duchamp, the kind of portraiture that turned the art world on its head, where that portrait shows not simply the image of someone, but multiple images, side and front, the body and movement, what they're thinking. In short, these versions of modern portraiture share a much richer and much more complex view of the person being portrayed than what she looked like at that moment. And I suppose you could say that you could argue that all great art does this, but I think the point holds that the modern portraiture was actually this kind of argument for a kind of rich understanding rather than just an image. It seems to me that the richness of their definition of modern art is more interesting and perhaps a better touchstone for architects as well, than the virtues of simplicity and clean lines associated with modern architecture. So, I've been spending a lot of time lately thinking about things, artifacts, and I taught a seminar entitled "Taking Things Seriously," and the interest began with like looking around my office and my desk, and this is a colleague of mine, Coleman Coker, and the architects who I admire. It seems like they all of them, all of my colleagues, all of the architects that I run into in their offices, they have all these amazing things that were collected there. In a sense, I suspect that most architects are pack rats for touchstones that seem so much richer and more meaningful than the simplified ways in which we often put forth buildings in that child could do it sort of way. I remember my friend Paul Shepard in his amazing book, What is Architecture? And if you don't know that book, it's a really interesting read. But he was discussing Sir Richard Rogers' Lloyd's of London building, where Rogers was speaking on a kind of television show in the late 80s, I think. And in that, he recounted Rogers explaining that the lifts were on the outside because they wear out and need to be replaced. You know, a child could do it. Of course, there are escalators on the inside too. And Paul asks in this book, like, why are they also not so easily replaced? It seems that architects don't always speak the truth about their work and that there might be another agenda afoot. So, as much as many from the kind of canon of modernism might laud simplicity, I wonder if this is like Rogers's false explanation of why his elevators are on the outside of this famous building. This brought me to kind of revisiting this really amazing book by David Pye from 1968. It's called The Nature and Art of Workmanship. And in rereading the marvelous book, I was struck by the almost explicit criticism of modern architecture. He discusses the workmanship of certainty and opposes it to the workmanship of risk, terms that are, I think, a great contribution to the field. But he also addresses the ideal forms and design intentions. Here he goes on to explain that these so-called ideal forms are really easy to communicate. He points out that flat planes, perfect cylinders, arcs of curves are, in fact, very straightforward to draw. However, to fully describe the variegated surface and subtle shapes in this image, for example, like one would, in contrast, have to take an enormous effort. And he points out that the quality of an end project, a building, is often judged in relation to its intended design, and if the ideal forms are ideal simply because they're easy to draw, What again is so laudable about these ideal forms? Isn't it really richness and ambiguity that we like so much? It certainly puts Corbusier's, simple forms and light into question. I just want to read that quote from Corbusier because it's worth reading. Corbusier wrote, "Architecture is the masterly, correct, and magnificent play of masses brought together in light. Cubes, cones, spheres, cylinders, pyramids are the great primary forms which light reveals to advantage. The image of these is distinct and tangible within us, without ambiguity. It is for this reason that these are beautiful forms, the most beautiful forms. Everybody has agreed to that, the child, the savage, and the metaphysician." And I know in America these days that there are some prominent politicians who think that if they state something emphatically enough, it will become truth. But that's not actually true. And I personally don't see these simple forms without ambiguity as the most beautiful. I like ambiguity. I like richness, and I feel like we can overcome the difficulty of drawing to pursue a rich, meaningful modern architecture that doesn't default to simple diagrammatic clarity to provide its value. For pi, maybe it was just that these forms were easy to draw, and we were sold a bill of goods, as it were. We know the falsehoods of form follows function, and maybe we need to reassess the value of simplicity for its own sake. I think, frankly, the great modern architects all understood this too. Like, this is my favorite architectural drawing of all time. It's Mies van der Rohe's drawing for his Reeser house in Wyoming. It wasn't built, but it's an extraordinary drawing. And let's look at the way he's using the photograph to bring the richness of the natural environment in to define the character of the interior of the house. It's less about the proportion of the built artifact alone, but rather as barely a frame for this extraordinary circumstance. Similarly, like Walter Gropius wrote the introduction to The Japanese House by Engel. This is an amazing book that I'm sure your library has, and it's an incredible tome that just describes in straightforward drawings and photographs the richness of the traditional Japanese house. Um, all right. So I fear that listening to the sales pitch, I feel like we've just been listening to the sales pitch when believing that clean lines, et cetera, are a value judgment, that's been a kind of siren's call that has all too often landed modern architecture on the rocks of a kind of ruthless atmosphere. And this is my last proposal. Um, and it's a kind of pushback against that version of architecture as being understood as a composition parenthetically removed from circumstance, as well as that idea that architecture is authored by an individual. Like, this is my office, and I believe that the best work arises not from a singular vision or from an individual, but from the collected voices of many, from architects, from clients, from consultants, from sites, from engineers, from workmanship. I think our work comes from many hands and has many voices. And here I should emphasize that the work that I'm going to show you tonight is authored by my office. It's not just authored by me, especially my partners, Ernesto Cragnolino and Tim Whitehill, who are equal partners with me. And I see architecture as an act of profound optimism. And it's one of the great pleasures of being an architect is like you're always involved with this optimistic future. And then we try to make places that provide a sense of grace to life, and we measure this by their intimate experience and the pleasure of the lives lived in our buildings in these intimate moments, like those first slides that I showed. And then there's the work. So I'm almost through with my little preamble. Um, as I've alluded to so far, engaging the rich conditions of circumstance is an incredibly important the sort of start for our work. Sometimes we begin with a stunning situation, like this house I'm currently working on. It's in Hokkaido in a town called Niseko. It has a picture-perfect view of a snow-covered volcano, and in that kind of a condition, like our principal efforts lay in highlighting and engaging what's special about that circumstance. In these situations, we often pose buildings to mediate between those conditions, presenting and heightening their special qualities and contrasting their respective characters through an invitation to live in all of these different worlds. At other times, we find ourselves in a more compromised condition and have to refocus our attention, like in the tight central city lot of this more modest-sized house, for example. I mean, you can see what's happening just by looking on the right side of that slide. Like all the little houses in the neighborhood are getting torn down, and these McMansions are getting put up right to the lot lines and really big. And like in this like condition, we employed an architecture to shield from the encroaching neighbors and create this sort of prime canvas and selective backdrop to what was most beautiful in the place, creating a kind of oasis-like refuge around one this beautiful live oak tree in the rear, and representing this sort of overlooked but magnificent oak as the building's face. Right, that's when you go in, and the other one was from the ground. So frame. So I wanted to share 6 houses, 5 in Austin, 1 in Dallas. Actually, this was the wrong image. I had updated this, I thought, but anyway, this was when I thought I might go through more houses, 9. Um, uh, anyway, I wanted to share these houses, like houses in particular, because as I stated from the start, I really believe that we experience architecture intimately, and it's in the domestic situation where this is perhaps most poignant. These 5 houses capture a kind of range of different circumstances individually, and I hope collectively might demonstrate a concerted strategy for how we engage the myriad conditions of circumstance to enrich and enliven our buildings, presenting our version of Frank Lloyd Wright's sustainable ecosystem, one in which each component of the natural world, the built environment, and human life supports the other components and thrives as a consequence. And I thought the houses I chose in particular um, uh, begin with some very significant constraints and kind of grow to ones that have a little more freedom. The reason this slide is up at the moment, I don't know if you can see my cursor, is just to give you some, I can't, I'll look here, just to give you some idea of the city of Austin, Texas. So the downtown is here, the university is here. It's a city that was modest in size for a long time and is now something like the 11th biggest city in the country or something. But that's because it's sort of like a huge range that they consider Austin. To the west is the hill country, and you can see the sort of continuous development for miles and miles. To the east is sort of richer farmland. To the south, to San Antonio is one continuous kind of development. And it's like there's a city grid, and then you start to get the hills and things start to adjust to it. And you'll see this as we show up in some of the buildings. The first project I was going to show you was just a very suburban condition. I think you can see from this sort of aerial sort of Google Maps thing, of just like, house after house in a kind of suburban condition. There is this sort of green swath that goes through here, which is a creek. In Texas, there's this part of Texas, there's not a lot of soil. So when it rains, the water quickly drains into the creeks. And so this can be a trickle, and then it can be quite like deep very quickly. Um, and what one sees is on all these sort of quarter-acre lots is houses next to each other, and then this sort of big area next to it that wasn't developed. And in this particular site, I'm trying to remember the drawings that we have in here, there were several really large oak trees, large enough so they would be considered heritage trees. You can't sort of touch them. And right in the middle of the site, and as the site kind of descends into the creek, and the property was like certainly more of a bargain, shall we say, because nobody thought they could really build a decent sized house on this. And so we did this house where it's like, well, why not have the house, could the tree go through the house? And it's a building where we had to adjust some things that one doesn't really notice. Like if you can see, like right in here is where the ground sloped down significantly from this point. So that tree, by the time you walk around it, you're up about 5 or 6 feet above grade. But you can see it's wood here, and there's a big hole that allows water to go through, and so the tree thrives. It's probably a couple hundred years old, 150 years old, but it hopefully will live for another several hundred years in this kind of condition of enriching the house, the life of the house as well. And as one enters into the house on grade, you then find yourself thinking you're on grade. You find yourself about 14 feet above grade into the treetops of this neighboring creek. And the condition of this house that seems so compromised by houses all around it and these big trees on the lot, like ends up feeling like they're on many acres of their own property. That this was just the aerial, and you can see like the house like right next to it, and then this is that big tree coming through the roof of this house. And I just put in a couple of images just to sort of show this sort of condition of living here, despite the way that where the constraints end up being something where the house that builds that gives sort of fodder to the authority of the house. I know when I was in school, it might not have been explicit, but it was implicit that clients are really meant to be patrons, and projects are, really like the buildings are opportunities for artistic expression. And I just find that the interest in projects is often working with things like constraints, and like it's a really lovely condition that so many of you are working at the same time as you're in school. I think that, and there's so many variables in architecture. The more things you can hold constant, like that you can work off of, just the better. Anyway, this was another condition, also a very modestly priced house, in a similarly suburban condition, where like that's our house, and it just happened to be that as they develop these hills, they do it in areas that are reasonably flat. You can tell from the contours, and then you can see how quickly the contours dropped from this project. So this was a property that none of the properties had been built on inside this kind of valley. The biggest problem with this one was that the street actually started right from the curb at about 35 degrees, and even staging a building was difficult. And so the first thing we did was to build a platform to build the house from, and built this very simple house on a kind of steel frame. Where you came in high and descended into the lower rooms. And the consequence of that, because it had a small budget, and because we were trying to keep the things reasonable, not spend money in ways that you didn't have to, we have a really tight envelope. And the consequence of this is where they own less than a quarter of an acre, but they feel like they're in a jungle. And you come across this bridge to enter the house, because it can be effectively one room wide. You get multiple views from every room. Um, there are shades and all of that built in, but in those sort of pockets, but you certainly don't seem like you ever need privacy. And by taking advantage of this kind of odd constraint, we ended up being able to do this house that was particularly special, I think, and enriched by circumstance. I put this one in just because against this sort of ever-present view, we often like to do these kind of other spaces, like the primary bath that's dark and is actually removed from the light. But even the way that we kind of wet glaze the windows that to act as a kind of mirror from the outside as well. I mean, it's not mirrored glass. It's just without the depth of mullions, it ends up embracing its reflective qualities. And like, I'm really proud of this house. Like, I feel like it was such a kind of amazing circumstance to go into a pretty uninteresting, at least architecturally, suburb, and to drive through that kind of mess and then end up in this treehouse. Um, to continue that same theme, and I'm trying to move quickly because I'm trying to save a little bit of time for the things at the end. My preamble took a little longer than I wanted. Like, this was yet another typical suburban condition. I mean, these were the kind of things that I feel like were shunned when I was a student. Like, one wanted, I don't know, a museum of experimental cinematography at Checkpoint Charlie or something where the program made things better. And I actually really, really enjoy finding circumstances where the problem is something that is more difficult. The constraints are things to embrace. So this was the last lot in this neighborhood that was undeveloped, because they had let all the water run through this lot. And it's at the end of a cul-de-sac with a kind of pie-shaped lot and a number of very large trees. Like you can see from this drawing, like these are all protected trees or heritage trees. And we didn't cut any down. And we proposed a building that had a series of masonry volumes and then bridges between them. So from the cul-de-sac, the pie, when it comes in to a kind of fairly modest, innocuous home, and then inside, it's again another world. This is a slightly bigger lot. I think it's a third of an acre, and there are houses all around next to it. I think I have an aerial in here somewhere that show that. But it's certainly not the experience that my clients have. Um, looking back the other way, uh, because I kind of Wet Weather Creek goes through here, like the hill drains through this site. The main living spaces, this whole bar is set up as a bridge, um, hovering above the ground, and the water goes through, and it actually aids to the kind of lushness of their inner garden. I got a note from this client. It just won an award, and the client wrote me back a note sort of saying that it's like a green wonderland there. And I felt like, what a lovely thing to kind of say, like not to so much talk about the building, but to talk about the circumstance of experiencing it. Um, we try and build things well, and we try and contrast things. So like the glass is all like floor to ceiling and kind of wet glaze, like you would a kind of a kind of tower or something. And then that's contrasted with this brick that's actually made for historic buildings. It has this been tumbled, so it looks kind of old. And then the buildings are multifaceted, like that Duchamp painting, where there's never a single view, but always multiple views and light coming in from multiple angles. And like, this was an amazing tree, but looking at it would also be seeing the neighbors. So we've kind of shielded it, so the only way to sort of see it is this kind of framed view that just catches the nature. Um, and then there's a kind of interest, like I like to build well for all kinds of reasons. For durability, I like to think my buildings age gracefully, our buildings age gracefully, but some of it is also like the kind of careful detailing of how one can get one element to slip by another, and then use not just glass, not just as a transparent medium, but as something that where we can embrace its reflectivity, creates this kind of amazing world in here. I mean, it's not a complicated shape. This is not a Danny Libeskind-like project, but the kind of richness of what we're like, what exactly are we looking at? What's reflection? What's like what I remember taking a seminar about Corbusier from a really interesting man when I was in school that talked about the glass is always a void and the concrete is always a solid. And I think glass is so much more interesting than just a transparent medium. It's something that at times can be transparent, at times can be reflective, and at times can be both. This is the little house we just finished, and I just took some photographs about 6 weeks ago. It's still being punched out, and now the trees are all kind of leafed out. But I wanted to take the photograph before that because you couldn't see the house like once it was sort of finished. It's in East Austin, and Austin, the city grid of Austin are 50 by 150 lots. And there's usually an alley between them, and and because Austin has become kind of hot and in a kind of real estate market, they tend to max out their floor area ratio. Like in Austin, it's 0.4. So and there are tricks to making it seem bigger. So people are building houses and additional dwelling units to max out what they can on their property. And this is this project we did, and our clients found this very unusual condition where they bought two lots end to end. You can't really tell from this aerial, but this is the top of a hill, and it comes down quite dramatically here, so that this street ends there and picks up again here, and this street ends here and picks up here, and the alley ends there. So they had a lot that was, it was only 45 feet long, but it was 320 feet long. Sorry, 45 feet wide and 320 feet long. And there were a couple of designers, graphic designers, the very accomplished people. She did the original graphic layout for Dwell. He just did typeface for IBM, these amazing things. But I mean, if you can imagine a more uptight person than an architect, you might think of a typeface designer who cares about microns as opposed to, fractions of an inch. And the house lays out pretty simply, because there are big setbacks you can see in the dashed lines, like this is the building line. And there's a hillside here with some exposed stone, unusual stone. Austin is primarily limestone, and this is sandstone, which I've not seen anywhere else in Austin. And the hillside was falling down, so there was a lot that we did to stabilize the hill at first. But then, having set that up, we then get these kind of very beautiful buildings, like with a pool in between. That are on the one hand like the building on the left is a one-bedroom home. It's 1,800 square feet. And the one on the right is a studio, as well as a guest room and a little kitchenette and things. But they're kind of rigorous geometry, I think, forms a kind of measure to the site. So you get some idea of the circumstance when the trees are dormant. That's the city of Austin. This is the sort of relationship. And the buildings just sit very kind of like gently on the landscape, one could say. They're Corten. Sometimes the Corten is perforated, so you get these conditions where you get to see through it. And the two buildings have this relationship around a pool. You can't see in the photographs, but I was just explaining to Rich earlier that it's like a Carl Andre sculpture. Like the coping is all um, uh, uh, brick. It's all kind of stacked brick, so no brick were cut. So getting a contractor that's not like an artist to do a building where the crassness of pouring a pool would actually work out to be the condition where all the bricks would be parallel and the same spacing and uncut was an effort. But when you go there, it's really special. It hovers because of the landscape when like they have their bikes and all of that they park underneath. That's Mike kind of ascending into the house, and up there you get this kind of really lovely world. It's a very tight-knit neighborhood, and yet they live in this slight oasis. That we seeded the hills, so they're all like wildflowers and things now, and these trees now have all they're deciduous trees, so now they're all kind of full. Our spring has come and gone. In Texas, it's already hot there. And Jeanette. And one of the reasons I was putting this one in, I like it very much. I like the kind of modesty of it in some ways, but then in contrast to, or as points of stasis against, this sort of ever-present pull of the out of doors, we put in these kind of rich conditions. Like this is just a powder bath with terrazzo and kind of lavender marmoleum, or a kind of inner dark primary bath, or these. We found this sort of incredibly beautiful soapstone that's kind of detailed cleanly and acts as almost a kind of something to hold on to as the kind of pull of the out of doors catches you. It was a simple building to make with some steel moment frames. It's all like, I mean, I think it's 97% sort of almost carbon neutral. But I just put this in because I had a couple of nice images of like, this is that rock condition and this condition where the building is like almost a measure of it. And like, this is the way that I was there for a drink recently, and like just watching the sunset on the patio, like with this kind of very beautiful condition. Like, I can't do anything as beautiful as this natural rock condition, but I can certainly engage it into my house. And I think the beauty of this is not that it's kind of all orthogonal, but it's actually that the building is a kind of frame for engaging these much larger circumstances that are really beautiful and powerful and ever changing. Continue with the kind of suburban journey we've been going on. This is a kind of area of town that was developed in the 70s, and now those buildings are all um, they're all kind of, they reached the end of their life, shall we say, but it's in a very beautiful and also very central part of town. We had a site that was positioned at this sort of top of a hill overlooking a green belt, kind of protected green belt. And it's a kind of pretty straightforward house, a little bit bigger, about 4,000 square feet, where one enters on the top because the hill descends pretty quickly. Um, but that's what it looks like from the other side. And it's this kind of hovering bar, like overlooking this incredible landscape. And while most of the other houses in the neighborhood, even the more modern ones, are kind of tucked into the hillside and closer to the street, we were kind of trying to do something that would really embrace this sort of large expanse in front of them. Descending into the house. I never really liked going down into a house, but we had to position the house here to get the kind of views. And if anybody's worked professionally and about kind of and has dealt with codes, like, there's a maximum height that you can build a building. So, this is actually the maximum height that the building is able to be built. So the more we moved the building out, the lower it had to go. Which is okay. I mean, it actually left this kind of really lovely condition where the building sits very modestly in the landscape, and you meander around a kind of flat field that we made for the kind of one area you could kind of throw a ball or kick a ball or something there, into this kind of beautiful interior environment where we have these kind of custom glass conditions. In this case, we had a little higher budget, so like there's a lot of custom made things, and it's really a device for engaging the landscape, but also because of its thinness, like it's a building that like that was looking one way in that room, this is looking the other way, and I feel like this is an important position that I try and kind of utilize for all of our work, where or much of it anyway, where we like to occupy what I guess an academic would call the liminal position, like that position in between. I was reminiscing with a friend earlier today about my time living here, and I used to live about 2 blocks from here on Beacon between Hereford and Mass Ave. 35 years ago. And it was a tiny apartment, but it was the front room of one of those beautiful buildings. And my favorite place was just to be in the bay window, where I was inside the building and in the street at the same time. And it was so lovely. And so this whole house lives like that, where you look one way into this protected garden that now is kind of full of foliage and things. The dilemma with architects is they take photographs like right when a building is done, but landscape architects won't take a photograph until like at least 3 or 4 years, and that's really when we should do ours too. But they're smarter than architects. And you can see how thin it is by how you can sort of look right through the building. But it has this incredible condition of a very intimate front yard with these kind of carefully crafted pieces, and then this incredible expanse. This is the primary bedroom, and as much as there's some lovely things about the built-in bits of special blue marble and things like that, like the real effort was to make a room that felt like it was sort of hovering over this rich landscape. And then in this case, there were, it was a really lovely family. It is a really lovely family. And there were these kind of lighthearted moments. This is the children's playroom where like a closet opens and they can kind of climb up this wall. It has a continuous clear story on the front side. There were some architectural reasons about popping off the ceiling and things like that, letting light in high, but there's a hammock up there. And so they're in the position where they know everyone coming and going. But the building is really set up as a kind of device for measuring this very beautiful circumstance, um, and defining it. And then, like, this is the basement, right? This is the floor below with this incredible view of this green belt. I mean, you really are in the middle of a the 11th biggest city in the United States, and this is pretty not quite downtown, but a 4-minute drive to downtown, and they get to live like this. And then, as in terms of those points of stasis, like this is this little, what would you call it? A love seat that we built in that's deep enough for both parents and the two children to sit next to each other and read a book together because they were a kind of sweet, close family. Um, I really love doing this thing, but this was an effort to get a contractor to do and cast in place concrete in the States. Um, the fifth house I was going to show you is as I'm moving from more constraints to less. This was a house. The reason I put the first house in was because we had it on a little homes tour, and this really lovely, slightly older couple came by, and they came by again, and they came several times. They brought their children, and they said, "Well, we have this piece of property. It's been in the family for a long time, and do you think you could do a modern house there?" And I mean, it is the best view I think I've ever seen in Austin. It's really like this extraordinary place. And while I think you could criticize our work in some ways as saying, well, they're clever solutions to difficult problems, this is one where we had quite a lot of flexibility. There were significant constraints to take advantage of, but not so much to work around. So it's the sort of top of a hill. This is a kind of funny part of town where it was overgrazed and a lot of cedars and junipers kind of grew up in place of the grasslands. But the oak trees don't usually grow so much here because it's sort of much more rocky soil. But there were a few stands of them. There was one here, and a couple in here. And so we built around them. These in particular, like if they survived on their own that long, we weren't going to knock them down, but they were sort of right. This was the area with the best view. I'm sort of going through, not really explaining the plans, but I think one gets a kind of idea. So it's a sort of 1-bedroom house for these kind of folks that are grandparents. Offices, primary bedroom, primary suite, all the living spaces here, outside porch, kitchen, sort of back of house. And then downstairs, there are more bedrooms and things like that. And it's really like two anchorages, two pieces built into the hill, and then this bridge between. But this is the circumstance. And if you've been to Austin, you might know this sort of iconic bridge, the Pennybacker Bridge. Downtown, if it was a slightly bigger image, you might be able to see that's the UT Tower, the Texas State Capitol, the kind of towers and things. It's a pretty magnificent view, and it looks down the river, and it also looks the other way. And so we had this amazing circumstance to work with, where one kind of had these beautiful trees, and we decided to make a kind of moment out of them. So you enter through this courtyard, celebrating their richness, and then arrive in this world that is like all about a fabulous view. It sits like just under the ridge of the hill. So my daughter's school is just on the next hill on the other side of the river, and like even though I know right where it is very hard to see, which is something I also take some pride in, except when the sun is hitting the glass, and then you get some kind of reflectivity. But you come in, and the building is very modest. It seems like a kind of there's something interesting. And I brought this building up in some ways to say, like, to bring up this particular issue that I find like powerful as a designer. I think designing buildings is very much like making a film. Like it's like you set up a series of expectations, and then you make discoveries along the way. And those discoveries aren't always exactly what you're expecting. Not that it's a horror film, but that hopefully it's a nice one. But one goes towards something, and then you realize there's something more interesting happening over there. And so there's a view when you come to this hill, but it isn't really given to you. You cross across a bridge, kind of weaving through the trees, which was bringing the W sections in between the trees was a little bit like sewing. The contractor gave us a bit of a hard time on this one, but I think they enjoyed like the precision of it. Um, one gets the idea that there's a view, but you're also then start to kind of experience this really lush garden. It was a fairly big piece of property, and so but we had a really good landscape architect. We worked with a man named David Hawker, and he really helped us develop this kind of beautiful interior courtyard that is very intimate. The landscape slides through the house, like underneath it, and the main living spaces sit above. So just a couple of images, just because I like this condition of the land going through the house. Um, and then from the other side, you get this sort of idea of this kind of floating building that all looking towards a view. It is worth saying, like, I mean, right now, Austin is starting to heat up, but it's pretty nice for many months. But even in the summer, if you have shade, especially at the top of the hill, you always have breeze. Like they're out there all year long. and grandkids in the pool, and they're in the shade, in the breeze, in that kind of large porch, I guess. But this is really what the building was about. I mean, it has this incredible view. There's a, we put this hole in the roof in part because it was such a horizontal house, such a house about a view out. And then we wanted to also then frame the sky. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But all the rooms in the house have these kind of views. The rooms are sort of in between this incredible view and then this very intimate courtyard, this kind of liminal position, as I was saying. So one side of that room looks towards the view, and the other side looks back into this courtyard. And then there are these beautifully crafted pieces that open up to a bar when they come in from the garage. They might not walk across that bridge every day, but they have this other little like lovely courtyard that opens to the sky. It has the west view, so there's this beautiful screen that we've put up to kind of and there is a neighbor on that side, this kind of gigantic house, and we didn't really want to see that. So we did this kind of curving, fretted timber thing. And then if you see the way we did the walkway, you get this incredibly beautiful effect of the stones on edge with shadows that I feel like I couldn't do anything like that as a composition. But to set something up where the setting sun casts these beautiful shadows across a variegated surface is pretty poetic. So, and then I put this one back up because I wanted to kind of reference that hole again, just for, I don't know, like, I guess I've put a bunch of holes in roofs, and there are things I like about that. Like I said, I did that in part. We did that not because we wanted to frame the sky at the same time as we were framing the view in a different way. But we had this, that's that kind of hole, and the shadows are quite beautiful. But we had this event last summer where we had a full eclipse of the sun that went right through Austin, and they had a little party. The house had just been finished, and this is actually my old TA. She's an architect, but she was the contractor. She was the PM, the project manager, and her whole family. And looking through that skylight at the full eclipse of the sun, this sort of once in a century kind of event, it was pretty beautiful. And I feel like I've been telling everybody that we did that hole because we knew the eclipse was coming, but but I feel like you do a beautiful hole and you things open up, possibilities open up. Okay, so I was trying to save a little bit of time for this house. This is the last one I was going to show you, and it's a slightly bigger house in part of Dallas called Highland Park. Highland Park is pretty Tony. This is our project. It's got a gallery building, a kind of garage underneath this big building, and it's about 12,000 square feet. It's the little one on this block. Like, look at some of these. In fact, these are all the immediate neighbors. And I mean, it's a lovely, lovely part of town, but a fairly Tony one as well. And our clients were art collectors, and they had done a kind of search for architects and looked at lots of folks, and I think in the end chose us in part because they knew it would be an important project for us. And we put a lot of effort in it. And it's an unusual set of circumstances. This is the first project we'd ever worked on where there was nothing of particular value on the site. There wasn't a tree, there wasn't a view. It's a bigger property, but it had an alley that wrapped around two sides of it. But really the big constraints were this odd condition of Highland Park code, where this is things we would be familiar with, like that's the front building line, and you can't put a wall or anything up. Like, they really want a kind of lawn leading up to a villa, because half of the building square footage has to be between this line and this line, which leads you to things like this, right? Big lawn, big building, impressive from the street. It wasn't exactly what we wanted to do, but working with those constraints made a kind of interesting building. We actually thought this was an interesting position for the building to be in, and given that we had to put 50% of the mass there, a lot of it is there. There's also these funny conditions where like you couldn't put anything higher than the 14-foot plate height back here, which they wanted a gallery and it needed to be a little higher, so we dug down a little bit to make that work. But we ended up with something unexpected. The building is set up as a kind of, again, an in-between thing between a front courtyard. We built up a kind of, you can't do a wall, but we did with David Hucker again, we did this sort of mound of riprap of kind of stones planted with flowers and cactus and all kinds of amazing things that grow in Texas, and then an inner courtyard, which is sort of more private. It's worth probably saying this is a really lovely family, super smart, but they have three kids that are little, and they have real art in this house. They have art worth, seven figures, and they wanted to live with the art, which is kind of amazing, I think, and it was part of the project. But you can see the sort of boomerang shaped kind of limestone bar that kind of defines two different courtyards, and then the sort of open space in between, sitting between them. Um, uh, so approaching this building, because we had the alley, we didn't have to have a car go up there, no driveway. So one approaches this, and this is all with this was on the neighbor's property, and these big magnolias are there, but everything else here was made by us, like the landscape person. The trees were brought in, the plantings were brought in, and they're unusual for Dallas. Like you don't get this kind of pine-like stuff there, and it's this kind of very beautiful condition of wandering in sort of under this limestone bar. Um, Looking from the sidewalk before all the kind of foliage had grown in with this, the bar kind of hovers and the sort of glass in between. These are views that are no longer possible to get of a building because it's all kind of grown in. But I would like to use them because they show you what the building is like, I guess. This is a 35-foot, 34-foot cantilever, sort of big sort of entry thing that one enters under. Um, that's the office and gallery behind, but one comes in under this, thinking you're heading towards there, but turns to go into the main house, where there's this very beautiful painting by a guy named Stephen Perino, that sort of that's inside, but there's a big sheet of glass here that's detailed in a kind of minimal way, and then under that cantilever is a hole cut to the sky with this big beautiful tree that we planted in it, all clad in glass on the inside. So it has these beautiful reflective qualities, like infinity room. Like and I guess I was putting the plan upstairs, and this is the primary suite with he has his own bathroom and closet, and she has her own closet and bathroom. But that's that whole, should be a tree in that drawing. But like her bathtub is here with the sort of obscured glass there. His closet is here, and it's like the most public part of the house is also the bit that is the most private, which is kind of sexy, I think. Anyway, you come into this beautiful environment. This is looking back towards the street, and you start to realize that the street is no longer very visible because of all the trees and things in this little mound that we planted. This gives you some idea of that cantilever. This is the main building, sort of in the building behind, separated by about 8 or 10 feet. Through to the street, where you get some idea of the context, I guess. I want to get through this a little bit just so I can talk about a couple of technical things. The building takes this bend to try and define an interior world, and then inside you get this condition of being between these two worlds. I mean, this is really where one should probably use a wide-angle lens to see both or have two images, but it is really like being in the middle of things, between this world of this sort of private backyard courtyard and this kind of front one with these big walls of glass, 32 feet that slide away. The wife's office is upstairs in this kind of position of being able to see everything. This is a Ed Ruscha painting by the dining table, where they wanted a pendant. Like finding a pendant in front of a painting was an interesting task. The kitchen and the family room are in this kind of knuckle crux in between, and the sort of, one gets the sense of this living room with the double height space, and the light coming from multiple sources, the gallery overlooking the living room and into the primary bedroom and the private place of the house, and you get this kind of condition of one courtyard connected to another one through the house, and reflecting things. And then, like, again, to think about the way the building might be a datum for understanding even some kind of not natural but artificial phenomenon. Love Airport is right near here, and it is actually quite beautiful to see the planes and their entrails kind of go by. I wanted just to talk about like some aesthetic decisions and how they have a consequence with construction. I feel like when I was a student, and certainly implicit in every office I worked in, and it was this sort of idea that the structure leads the way, that there's this kind of idea of a building, and then you come up with a structure, and it determines a kind of rigor for the building. But this is a little bit different. So we had this idea of a kind of mm, masonry bar that was pretty unadulterated, like the windows in it, and then it had this big cantilever. And I feel like, you know, this would be the way that you would typically do that. This sort of idea of making like a big truss, right, with some backspan. But that was the kind of first things we were thinking of. And then we thought, well, this is problematic because in order to make this, I think the next slide, in order to make this sort of the upstairs rooms work, there was this big upstairs courtyard. You know, I really like this part where we've done, this is all Indiana limestone, and we used it because it's really consistent in color. Like local limestone in Austin goes from kind of browns to grays, but this is all almost identical. It's the stuff that like Washington, D.C. was built out of, and many places in the United States. It's the beautiful limestone, but we wanted it, this sort of pattern to start to kind of pull apart a little bit like a fraying cloth. And behind that was a courtyard, and then all these upstairs rooms then look into this area. And it was a way to both be consistent with this upper bar and have it not be so ruthless that you couldn't get any lighter view towards the front. But had we done this version of construction, we would have had like a great big W section to have to kind of pass through there and box out, and we would have had, you know, a bunch of kind of difficulty. And then on the back side, there's a place in the primary. I don't know if you noticed it. I didn't point it out, but I will in a second. Where the primary bedroom window drops down below the bottom of the building and would cut the structure there. So we thought of this sort of other way to do it, where we would take, actually, it's the biggest cultural section you can buy, a W40, um, uh, like, and have a beam along the front that would be on the bottom, and it would cantilever. And if you looked at the numbers, it's the same deflection, and then the same one in the back, but on the top. And so the building hangs from this beam on the backside and is built up from this on the front. And that's a kind of, how could you say this? It's kind of an illogical solution. Like it's a little bit odd, but it's done in a way to allow this kind of aesthetic condition. And I think it's very much engaged. Like we care a lot about construction and detail and structure, but we don't want it to tell us what to do. We want to use it in a way that will liberate the building. So like you can see how once you do that, well, you can make the top of that building anything you want. These are these big ass beams for, I mean, I don't know what the neighbors thought when we started building this thing, but uh, why did I put these? Oh, I put these in because I just wanted to show you like how incredibly light this is, the section right through. I think I have a bigger drawing of that. Um, right through the stones that I said kind of pulled apart like a fraying cloth. It's like a plate in the middle that's just holding some of the horizontal movement. At the top, there's a kind of hollow steel section that's like 2 inches thick, just to kind of keep the horizontal movement. But it's so much more delicate than if there was a big beam. Like you can see, this is Janelle's office, looking out onto that courtyard, and the inside of that is really delicate. And that couldn't have been possible if we had to actually deal with some larger structural conditions. That there's a big beam in here, you know, but not up like where we wanted the building to be more delicate. Right? Or on the back side, this is that bit where we wanted the window from the primary to drop down below the structure. So that's where there's a big beam on the top, and the building like literally hangs from that big beam to get to this like window seat condition in that building, where the glass then comes down kind of unnaturally low. And oh, I was going to show a couple other images like that. I feel like, how can I say this? Like I was thinking back of my time here when I was putting the talk together and thinking about like what I liked so much about the idea of students working at the same time as being in school is this idea that practice might enliven their academic work, and their academic work might enliven their practice. And so I was just trying to show these examples where there is a kind of back and forth rather than a kind of straightforward linear idea of like you figure out how to build it and then that sets up a rhythm or something. And so even this kind of, what I think is this very beautiful space, this kind of infinity room up to the sky in the middle of this cantilever with these kind of glass panels that read very abstractly because they come all the way down to the soffit and all the way up to the top of the building on the inside. And have all this kind of reflection. They're kind of glued rather than having any kind of a mullion. Um, and it's a kind of simple way to build, but it makes such a difference in its experience. Right? This condition here, right? That was just, this is just from our working documents or construction documents, you know, showing gutters and things like that. But that's the thing I was interested in, the bit about like how the glass might come all the way up to the very top of the building and all the way down to the sill, so that it's, you get this kind of minimal condition that um, that's it on the inside. This is that one condition where there's stone on one side and glass on the other. Um, so you get that condition of reflectivity not being interrupted by like, well, that's the flashing, you know, for the roof membrane. Or on the inside, there was, we really were trying to emphasize this incredible connection between inside and outside. And one does that in part with, keeping a ceiling going out or a floor going out, but that obviously has a kind of, and very minimal mullions. Um, but that obviously has a kind of care that you have to take with the sill condition, right? Or the head condition, or even the mullions where it's just a half-inch cold rolled plate that then we're kind of tapping into, and the things that can be kind of coarse, and then the things that have to be more precise, um, so that one can get that very beautiful condition where it seems like the glass isn't even there. And then I just wanted to look at like the most mundane part of the building, just to talk about how that also is really important in the reading of the building. Like one of the things that's actually so lovely about this, although I wouldn't say people go in and it's like, oh, look at that, is how clean the ceilings are. Like there's no Photoshop in here. And this is an area where you have to do fire suppression. There's a lot of air conditioning load, obviously. There's, lighting, they have real art, things like that. And we collected all of that in, like, rather than having a kind of operating theater, like everything we could collect, for example, in this sort of ring around this double height space, the air conditioning, the fire suppression, all of that. There's another image of that. Well, um, um, kind of run through that condition, right? That of, where are we? Of here and here, where like, that's the fire suppression. There's the HVAC runs through there, and it's like collecting all of this and to allow it to kind of happen in just that area liberated so much of the rest of the building. I think that was, yeah, that was all I was going to show. So just in exactly an hour. So thank you. I am so happy to take questions if there are questions. I'm not used to being tethered here, so I'm used to kind of walking around and talking, but I'll try and stay here. I don't know if
Hi, well, first, thank you for the lecture. It's great to hear the passion that you have behind these projects. It's just like absolutely lovely hearing like how you geek out on the details. But so all the projects are stunning, but there's also a lot of coherence between all of them. You very much have a very defined style, right? That's being followed, I feel. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about your journey and how you found your style and the way you approach the projects.
it's an interesting construction, your question. I have to think about it a little bit because I have to say, like, I have a twin brother. Like, I'm gregarious by birthright. Like, one of the things that's actually really lovely about being an architect is you work with other people. You work with clients, you work with professionals, consultants, you work with other people. I mean, some people are sole practitioners, but I'm not. I have two partners. I have a bunch of really important people in my office. And so part of what we do is working with folks. And I like to think you can always tell our work, but I think if you look at the collection of things, I think they look like our clients. Like, and it is true when the ones I've shown you there's a certain thread that runs through them. But I like to think that it's not like yet another Alterstudio building, but there's a kind of interest that comes from the particular circumstances of a place and of a client and their input. I think the question was about defining like how my journey and how we came to this style, and I think like this is going to sound funny, but I was blessed with coming to Texas without any work. I mean, I was pretty young still, I guess, older than you all, but I think I was 28 when I arrived in Texas. I didn't come with great personal wealth, so it's like, and it's not like I was a famous architect, so I might hang out a shingle, but nobody was knocking on my door. So I didn't have any work. Right? I did a lot of kitchen renovations. I was in a long distance relationship for a while, so I didn't really want to go out. So I learned by making things, by doing additions and things like that. But then I was teaching at the University of Texas. I came to Austin to teach for what I thought would be a year. It's been a long year. It's been a productive year, but it's been a long year. 1991 to, what is it, 2025? Um, uh, and um, as a faculty member, you're required really to do scholarship, and buildings can be scholarship. And these days, my primary effort is actually about the practice. And we're lucky enough, as Rich said, to win a lot of awards, and that's important. And I like to put effort in that. But at first, I just thought, well, I just want to look at buildings that were interesting. And because I was younger and happy to live a little like, cheaper, I traveled to see a lot of really interesting work that hadn't yet, it was before the internet. So like that hadn't been disseminated. So I went and looked at like Peter Zumthor's work and published it. And it was the first time I think Zumthor was published in the States. But I did this book about 5 Swiss architects. And I looked at like, Alvaro Siza's work and these things that were not very well known in the States, but because I had the privilege of having worked with a man named Rafael Mineo in graduate school, I knew about these kind of really interesting European architects. And I just was really interested in buildings. I know architecture is greater than buildings, but I really like buildings. And I feel like in academia, there's a lot of emphasis on expanding the interest and the scope of architecture beyond buildings. But I actually like to focus on buildings because they are infinitely interesting and so like it's so joyful to like actually get to live in beautiful spaces. I mean, this is a very, even though it's an old building, it's a really powerful one. And you guys are lucky to learn about architecture in a powerful building. So I learned about buildings like, not from my own, but from like architects I admired. And I was particularly interested in learning how they made them. And now there's Detail Magazine and there's El Croquis and all these kind of magazines that publish documents. But I was doing that a long time ago. We did these exhibitions of like looking at construction documents. And so when I started practice, when I started getting slightly bigger projects, I had this kind of wealth of information about how to make things and like just in terms of my own journey. And then I had these like I like working with folks. And so the first buildings I did were by myself, but my practice is so much better because it is not just my voice. They're, especially my partners Ernesto and Tim are so brilliant. And like I'm really interested in structures, but my partner Ernesto is a technical genius. He was my student when I first started teaching there, and he has an engineering degree and an architecture degree and an honors degree, and he's like he only has undergraduate degrees, but he's brilliant, and it frees me up to kind of ask for like outrageous things and then be told you can't do that, but you could do it this way, and so like I think one of the real pleasures is in designing things is coming up with something that you wouldn't have necessarily thought of. Like I certainly, man, maybe we don't teach, you all don't teach this way, but there was this sort of, we used to look at like Alvar Aalto sketches and there's like, it's a beautiful little sketch and it like looks like the building. And it's like, oh, it's just the genius man had it in his mind before it was built. But in my experience, that's not how really great buildings are done. Like they come through many iterations and through working things through in different voices, and sometimes they're code issues. Like I mean, it's the first time I've ever shown a code in a lecture, but it's like it actually really made a difference, like how we designed the thing. And I don't know, I would love to try if there are any patrons in the audience and want to hire me with a limitless budget. Like I'm really happy to try that. But I think the best work comes from constraints and difficulty. And, and honestly, when I look at the architects I admire in the world, almost all of them cut their teeth doing houses, and that kind of intimacy is present even in their larger buildings. Did I answer that question?
It definitely did. Thank you so
Okay,
much.
sure. Uh, okay.
Everyone, I mean, the 43 people have been raving about the
Oh,
project.
that's nice.
Lecture and love your passion. Were you about to?
But I would, no.
All right.
I can give shorter answers, and so we can have more than one question.
Okay, so the question is, the party and the details of your project seem to work so well together. Can you talk about how the larger and smaller scale decisions develop together in your design process? And you've got a minute for that.
A minute. Okay. Well, I guess the one thing I would say for that, and that's what I was trying to say earlier, this sort of idea about like a linear process, I think is false. Like that you come up with a partie and then everything kind of, this simple diagram just gets kind of fleshed out. I think, we are thinking about details when we're thinking about like overall form. And I think in that way of moving back and forth between scales, with different kinds of constraints, with having, someone's personal opinion, like a client that is just like, I just don't like red or something. It actually is less a hindrance. Sometimes it feels like the rug's been pulled out from under you, but like solving those problems leads us to things that we wouldn't have come up with before, and that is something like I really enjoying the work and I'm proud of, and I think if I'm glad it looks like the partie, the larger idea, and the details all work together. But that's in a large part because the details don't come after the partie. Like even that thing about the construction, like you would have thought we would have worked out the construction before we figured out the patterning of the stone. But actually, the construction changed, the larger structural system changed later in order to get this sort of aesthetic idea. We had dozens of different ideas for what that would be like. And when we finally reached the kind of thing we wanted, we realized we had to restructure our idea of this kind of cantilever. And if I'm glad it looks that way, that these things are intertwined, and I think it's because it's not linear. So, sorry, Angela, did you have a question or no? Sorry. Oh, okay.
If anyone else have a question, I definitely don't want to take the stage for the final question, but I do have, and I think it could be a longer conversation than the 1 minute, but I would very curious about your take on what you've said about designing architecture is like making film. And I think your project so beautifully demonstrated what Giuliano Bruno saying of both architecture and film make spatial meaning through movement, and how motion is a spatially generative activity. And I think particularly your image of the different people touching the elephant, I think it also kind of remind me of the duality of the film, which you can both kind of consolidate fragmented moment into a singular narrative, but it also could kind of deconstruct those seemingly unified space. And I just want to know more about the relationship between designing architecture and the filmmaking. How much of that is analogy? How much of those filmmaking and cinematic techniques has been influencing your design technique, both in terms of the collection, the curation of rich material, and then creating a unified spatial rating.
Right. So, okay, it's a great question, and one that deserves a longer answer than the quick answer that I can give now. But I think. I mean, when it's funny because when I was in graduate school, like I'm in this kind of nostalgic moment of being back where I went to graduate school, and like one of my closest friends was teaching film at NYU, and we would talk about architecture and film being the same, and they're not the same. They're different disciplines. But like the thing that's so interesting about film is I think is the way that the viewer is pulled into it, and it's very much about a kind of atmosphere and an experience. And I can't remember the name of, like when they have a tracking shot where like the camera's following someone and then someone walks behind them and then the camera shifts to something else. Like because of the angle that the frame that one kind of sees a film through, that it's I think most of the films that I really like are ones that kind of capture your attention, bring you somewhere, but then sometimes they pull the rug out from under you. Sometimes you realize, like, I thought I was going to do this amazing thing here, but actually, oh wait, over here is more interesting, and the world gets richer and richer. And I feel like one of the the reason I started talking about modernism is because I feel like the great modernists all understood architecture as something in motion, as something that's fundamentally humanist, as that you live through, you walk through buildings. Like Le Corbusier's architectural promenade, like you just have to look at the plans of his buildings and realize like that they're all cinematic. They're all about kind of setting up expectations and then making unexpected discoveries if you imagine walking through them. I mean, I think, there's always this thing about how architects sell their work. Form follows function. Like it didn't ever. I mean, it does to some degree, but it follows other things too. Like that's why I was bringing up the Paul Shepard thing. Like you can't listen to what architects are saying or how they're translated. Like toward, Verzoon architecture should be translated as towards an architecture, right? Not towards a new architecture, towards just like an architectural promenade was, I think, very much about being in the building. And I think that the thing that filmmakers do so well is they totally capture your attention and then they bring other things into bear. And I think like we create environments as well. We in fact create much richer environments because it's not all just caught in a single view, but it's caught in a kind of multiple view. Like when we were in graduate school, there used to be a man named Edward Seckler that taught history, and he was this little Jewish guy who looked like Einstein from somewhere in Eastern Europe. He had this thick accent. And he gave the most extraordinary lecture on early Christian basilicas, which for like a modern young architect, it's like, what could be more boring? But it was unbelievable. And he used like 7 or 8 different slide projectors in a room that was completely black, like so your eyes adjusted. And he had these kind of really faint slides of like blue light in different places, and his voice was booming and echoey in this room, and he was talking about how the experience of being in these places when Christianity wasn't legal everywhere, and like the only kind of glass you had was blue because of that's the technology at the time, and how dark they were and how cacophonous these places were, and you had all this stuff happening, and it like gave you a feel for what that space must have been like. So much more interesting than like the symbolic character of a vault, for example. And I feel like because of the way we translate architecture or mistranslate it through a series of photographs of like, and single kind of strong images, I think we start to teach that architecture is about composition. And it's really the least interesting thing about architecture, like what it looks like. I mean, I like to do beautiful things, but I think it's like how you set up an environment, and one that is full of surprises. And I think one reason we work with contrast a lot is like I love to contrast a big view with this intimate view, because even if you have a house on the beach in Malibu, like it gets to be normalized unless you actually have something in you don't realize you're living in this extraordinary condition. So like my clients on top of that hill, it's an amazing view. But I like to think they're reminded of how amazing it is, because they also are constantly experiencing the intimacy of this beautiful garden with succulents and flowering plants and things, just to recognize how actually exceptional it is. And perspective, frame. Thank you.